You're listening to Biotech Hangout, a live and unedited weekly discussion of all the latest news in our industry with a group of biotech insiders. I'm Eric Schmidt, and my co-hosts today are Sam Fazeli, Brian Scorney, and Yaron Werber. For more information about our hosts and guest speakers or to listen to the most recent episode, please go to biotechhangout.com. All right, guys, quite the wonderful week it feels like in biotech with the XBI breaking out into new ground and maybe the beginnings of a true bull market type of rally here. The news flow, as we'll talk about, was a little bit more mixed, at least on the fundamental side. We didn't have the best of data releases, but let's start with the macro, which I think is really the bigger news of the week. And Sam, perhaps you can introduce everything that's going on with Trump, the White House, MFN, pricing, tariffs, et cetera.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. It was quite an event that I'm sure pretty much everybody has watched it. We had Albert Bourla, all the key healthcare figures within the administration, and of course, President Trump. So the CEO of Pfizer and President Trump presenting essentially the first of what is expected to be many, or at least several deals between pharma companies and the administration, and the likelihood is that they are going to have this pretty much the same template. And we characterize this at our end as a win-win and a lose situation. And I think we'll probably almost certainly talk about all of that. So the win pretty much comes from the pharma industry and the president. Although, of course, all of these things depend on the absolute details that we get to. But a couple of things that we pretty much put to bed was a very draconian most favored nation pricing strategy, which was good to see that didn't come to fruition. And also the 100% tariffs that the president had announced to come in force on the 1st of October were obviously put to bed because these deals are starting to roll out. So that's great news. And of course, as you can see from the share price reactions, in general, the market and investors have seen this as positive for the pharma industry. So what did we get? We got President Trump got essentially two key targets of what he was looking for. One is all drugs sold in the US should be made in the US. I think a lot of pharma companies were already going down that route. So so that's great. And I think a vast majority of drugs are already manufactured in the US. Of course, we can all then discuss what does that mean to be in inverted commas manufactured in the US. Where does that decision gets made in terms of is it fill and finish? Is it final product? Is it where is it? So let's leave that to discussion later. We get some job increases, and this all is culminated over the past few months in what we've totted up to be about $432 billion of pledges by pharma companies and some large biotechs, which of course include ongoing R&D, ongoing capex, and some new manufacturing facilities, etc. The US gets a possibility of at least aligning non-US prices closer to the US. We'll see how that will work. Interestingly, I was just on a call with a UK physician, KOL, earlier today, and I asked him, if I gave you a survey of drug prices in the UK, would you be able to fill it? And he said, well, no, because nobody really knows what the prices are, and each area has got its own situation. And in fact, a lot of pharmacies aren't allowed to give out the net prices that they pay. So that's interesting as to where these calculations are going to be made. Nevertheless, that is a positive, and I think pharma companies are almost certainly going to end up launching every product, not the majority, which has been the case, first in the US now, because you want to set the price there and go and hope that the Europeans and other countries pay their fair share. And it seems like the majority of the impact is going to be on Medicaid and Medicare. I wouldn't call it an impact because I think what we're going to end up with is actually potentially more volume going through these various channels, or particularly the direct-to-consumer channels. And let's see how that all pans out. And lastly, so those are wins for the administration, win for the pharma industry. I'm sure there's a lot more detail folks are going to talk about in a minute. The lose is Europe. And the lose is in this form. If you have launched your product in the US at a price X, you go to Europe and say, I'm very sorry, but you're going to have to pay at least the net price equivalent of X. So let's say that's a 30% discount, not 70%, not 70, 80%, not 60%. And Europe goes, okay, fine. I'm going to increase my drug budget, which is great for pharma, number one. No, I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do. I'm not going to increase my drug budgets. I'm going to accept your price, but I'm going to have to restrict the drug even more. So that's another lose, right? And that's again good for pharma because they get the higher margin even if the volume is lower, and then and get same revenue. And then of course the other one is, which is the worst case scenario, which doesn't really, I can't count it as a win for pharma, but it's certainly a lose for European setup and patients, is that they go, no, actually we don't want the drug. Now, in some cases, I think that might happen. I think if you had a situation, I'm not particularly picking on, say, oral SERDs, but let's say the oral SERDs come along with essentially a major convenience factor, which will translate to better patient adherence and, of course, longer term better outcomes. But let's say that's welcome, and the companies are going, well, the competition is essentially generic, so we're going to have to be a lot higher price. And I think that's the sort of situation where we're going to have to think about how do we model that going forward. So let me leave it at that, and Eric, you can bring in everyone else to see how they want to,
Yeah,
what their take
wonderful,
was.
wonderful recap. Thanks. And I should have also introduced Brad Lonecar. I didn't realize Brad was going to be joining us as a speaker as well. But welcome, Brad. For the broader group, following Sam's terrific recap, is this a win-win-win? Are we kind of done now with this massive macro overhang around drug pricing that's really been weighing on the group, or are we still worried about something else coming into the fore?
Well, I think in today, you know, these days, you should always expect the unexpected. So I wouldn't say it's a guarantee of smooth sailing going forward, but I do think it was a genius move by Burla. And if you see some like Wall Street Journal reporting, like it seems clear that this is something that he and Pfizer did on their own. Like this wasn't a coordinated negotiation by the industry, so to speak, or all of the other major companies. I really think that he's in a unique position. I think that Albert Burla is arguably the only pharma CEO who really has like name recognition and gravitas with the general public, given how visible he was during COVID and just the way he literally tweets and continues to kind of speak publicly these days. I think that most people don't know who the other big pharma CEOs are, so I think it had a little bit of an element of gravitas to the announcement because of who he is. And I agree with everything that Sam said, and I think that he basically gave away almost nothing, and he gave Trump the political victory that he needed. And I think that's really the definition of a great deal. And now, Pfizer and arguably our industry, if all of the other companies sign similar deals, have a little bit of pressure off for the next few years and can worry less about legacy products and focus on investing and the revenue streams that new products are going to have. So I think it was a good deal for our industry. I think he was the right person to do it. I think he was arguably the only person that have could have gone first in this way. So my biggest reaction to all of that was like, thank you, Albert Burla, for basically doing all of us a big favor and also scoring our industry um, a PR win to the public, making us all look like what we should be trying to look like, that we're trying to do things to to help people out there. So I thought it was a truly a great news item for all of us.
Brian, your own, what's the impact on biotech? We mentioned that the XBI is breaking out into new levels we haven't seen, I think, really since 2001. Are we in a biotech bull market? Are generalists going to be interested with some of this news flow behind us?
I
Well,
think we're in. I'd say I think we're certainly in a rotation to biotech. I mean, it just seems like over the last couple of weeks, there's been this awakening to healthcare being, kind of a very valuable, undervalued sector amongst a lot of overvalued sectors, and I mean that's sort of bled into biotech, which has been arguably like one of the bigger underperformers in healthcare, which is one of the biggest underperforming sectors over the last few years. So it certainly feels like at minimal, somewhat of a reversion to more of normalcy. I mean, it's hard to say bull market, right? I mean, it's definitely a 2 month bull market relative to where we were, but it's still a relative bear market to where we are on a performance basis via screen back to like 2020, of course. But it does feel different, right? I mean, to Brad's comment, I mean, I kind of tend to agree. Like, you always expect the unexpected, particularly with this administration. But it does seem like we're in a bit of an environment where like good news is good news and bad news is good news. And people are using any reason to sort of be at least a little more invested in the sector. How durable is that going to be? I think there's a long way to go just to revert to sort of more of a normal valuation basis across a lot of these names. So will we go into like really the fanfare of a bull market? I think that remains to be seen. But there's still a lot of upside even if it doesn't go into that type of dynamic.
yeah, I mean, I totally agree. So and I'm sure you guys can all back me up. I'm happy to announce that we're getting in generalist inbounds, and which is unusual. And these are real generalists, like not the biotech sort of fringe generalists, but real generalists who are calling, not knowing a lot about the sector. The feedback we're getting is that interest rates are going to come down. They're getting a little bit worried the tech cycle is going to start ending at some point sooner than later, or on the horizon now, and they're rotating to the next risk level, the next alpha generator, and that's for them is biotech. And they're going to look at interesting names like an Ionis, like Argenix, like there's UCBs. There's sort of fresh new names for people to look at now. Um, to your point, Brian, so I'd argue that Eric, I remember when I was growing up under you, right? We had to be stock pickers, and we wanted to be in an environment where we're useful. And what we mean by that is that companies that had good values actually went up, uh, data that didn't work out, companies actually went down, and things actually acted rationally. And I would argue we're finally back to that level. Hard to say that we're in a bull market. I think we're just sort of um, we're finally back to value recognition, and we're still underperforming. Our trackers in the beginning of the year said we're going to underperform the market and we should be flat for the year. So I think we're tracking back toward that flat year over year, which is sort of where we think we should be for this year, and then hopefully next year is a better year.
Oh, it's funny you said that, Yaron. I still get a lot of chiding from my friends who read that Wall Street Journal quote that you just referenced of mine from 20 years ago, where I said, companies that had good news had their stocks go up, and those that had bad news had their stocks go down. It was a genius piece of insight on my part, and I'm glad you remember it as well.
It
But
still
yeah,
still works.
I mean, I hope you're
Eric.
right. Go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, just sorry, I don't want to take that particular conversation away, but in terms of what is still yet to be worked out is I don't know whether you guys have got this sussed or not, but I'm not quite sure where specialty drugs sit in the middle of all this in terms of even the new launches having to be priced at whatever MFN will be, which is kind of decided by US pricing. I don't know. And I also wonder, just a throwaway comment here, now that RFK has shaken hands with Albert Bourla, do we think the heat is off mRNA vaccines, or is that too much wishful thinking?
Those are great points, things that we need to keep in mind as we look forward. Yeah, I mean, from where I stand, Yaron, you must be a more popular guy than I, because I haven't gotten a lot of generals calls. We've gotten a couple, I will say, and even that is a sea change in optimism. Getting any calls, I'd say, from generalists is something that we're not used to in the last 6 to 12 months. And then, Brian, you made some really perceptive comments. I hope that we're in a glass half full environment, but I also worry that things are changing so quickly that we may, start to see, even aggressive posturing where, data sets don't only receive the benefit of the doubt, but they get all of the doubt, where buy-siders start believing everything that management teams tell them when markets, trees grow to the sky in terms of market opportunities, where all political headlines is dismissed as just being just that. So there's a fine line, I think, between optimism and pessimism. And unfortunately, I don't know that we've handled that line very well historically in our sector. I feel like we're always on one or the other side of it, and we just can't help ourselves due to other factors. But hopefully this time it'll be a little bit different.
Well, it's probably, Eric, to your comment. There's no way I'm more popular than you. I think it's purely probably a function of what we cover, perhaps, and so the names that are resonating, and maybe that's kind of what's getting traction. And look, this is the new tranche of innovators, right? That are frankly at this point are not even new. So we're talking about like the Argenixes, the UCBs. Ionis is the sort of the new kid on the block now that's resonating with people.
Yeah, terrific mid cap innovative growth stories that are just turning that cusp into profitability as well, which really will, I think, help the XBI going forward. But let's turn our attention to maybe some of the other headlines from the week. And there was a little bit of chatter and controversy coming out of the FDA. Brian, you want to start us off on that?
Oh yeah. This is kind of a fun story to kind of follow. So earlier this week, Dr. George Tidmarsh, who was recently appointed head of the FDA's CDER, this is the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. This is the center that really reviews most of the drugs that get approved by the FDA. He put a posting on LinkedIn indicating that CDER will be looking at surrogate endpoints used for FDA approval and criticizing some of the failures to confirm benefit. He cited the exon skipping drugs, so there's like Sarepta's Exondys 51. And I think we all know at this point, this has been one of the biggest sources of criticism for accelerated approval, this drug in particular, but the other exon skippers as well. But he also interestingly took specific aim at a drug called lupkynis or vocalosporin for the treatment of lupus nephritis, saying that it has significant toxicity and it has not been shown to provide a direct clinical benefit for patients. So this is kind of odd because lupkynis actually has full approval based on a 52-week randomized placebo-controlled study. And I guess, look, one could reach for an argument that a complete renal response is not a direct clinical benefit, but a measure of UPCR and eGFR improvements together. So in the world of approved drugs, that really haven't confirmed a clinical benefit, I would say this is, very, very far from an egregious case study for a very senior FDA official to be citing, at least from the information that's publicly available. Now, Adam Fierstein at Stat wrote this up, but it was definitely going around through the biotech gossip channels this week because Tidmarsh was actually once the CEO of a company called La Jolla Pharmaceuticals, but resigned in 2019 when Kevin Tang from Tang Capital, who's the largest shareholder and chairman of La Jolla at the time, was quoted in the PR announcing Tidmarsh's departure. Notably, the largest shareholder of Aurinia, at least as the last filing, is Tang Capital as well. So, once this all started to kind of blow up, Tidmarsh wound up deleting the post, saying that it did not reflect the views of the FDA or HHS. Aurinia also issued a press release titled "Aurinia Responds" to now retracted LinkedIn post, and that PR just reiterated that it had received full approval from the FDA. So those are kind of the facts there. And in the background, everyone's sort of like scratching their head at, what was the relationship back in the day between George Tidmarsh and Kevin Tang back at La Jolla, and are there any implications to such an odd citation from his LinkedIn profile as a critique of accelerated approval here? And obviously this has kind of implications for sort of the scientific rigor and at the FDA. And I know we all have differing opinions of the level of chaos that this current FDA currently has. But we'd love to hear any thoughts from you guys on that.
Yeah, we can go into the chaos in just a moment. Yaron, did you want to also note the IO Biotech news?
Yeah, so IOBio, also that this is a cancer vaccine it's fairly unique. They had amazing phase 1/2 data. They're targeting IDO and PD-1, PD-L1, and admittedly not a controlled study out of one center in Europe, but really sort of knocked your socks out of data. and they did a phase 3 that just read out. A lot of the KOL feedback is that the study was a little underpowered, and it looks like that was probably right. I mean, they just missed. It was 0.06 on PFS. Survival obviously was underpowered, but trending in the right direction. Some interesting, tidbits in the data as to in which population it works. This is frontline melanoma, by the way. And so they went to FDA. I mean, very very safe, by the way, on top of Keytruda, and showed better data than you would have expected on Keytruda alone. And obviously, it's a controlled study. In any event, remember this was an important case study, just given some of what CBER has said in the past. Admittedly, they were more skeptical about PFS as an endpoint than vaccines, but admittedly was more on the mRNA vaccine. And there was a question whether they'll be able to file because they literally just missed, and whether there'll be flexibility. And the answer was from FDA was no. You need to run another study. So the next test case is potentially going to be, and we're going to talk about this shortly. At ESMO, we're going to see data from Zanza in CRC, phase 3 data from Exelixis. And that's going to drive questions about what to expect from studies wherein most of the patients are coming from ex-US. But FDA is continuing. We're all trying to figure out what is this new flexibility going to do from FDA, and it's not necessarily going to be that easy to call. Is kind of what we're seeing on our side. It's kind of been there's flexibility, but it's not always what you expect.
Yaron, real quick, I just want to echo what you said and say that my personal take, for what it's worth, which is nothing, is that I think the FDA made the wrong call here. I've visited this company in Denmark and also interviewed her shortly after the data came out. And the person running this company, my Brit Zoka, is a very serious researcher. So this is definitely not a case of like, a hypey CEO who's like whipping up, investor fervor to get something approved that should not get approved. I mean, this barely missed, as you said. And I think this is an example of like p-value worship that's not in the best interest of science or patients. And I understand why the FDA might not want to make precedents or really vary widely on how different things are treated maybe in different ways, but to me this would have been a classic example of, if you really look at this and say, is there a signal going on here? Maybe this deserves an accelerated approval while we take the years that it takes to run another study to see if it could confirm or not. To me, it's a great example of what would have been the utility of something like that.
So obviously that was a close call, a tough decision that the FDA had to make. Brian mentioned the chaotic LinkedIn release from George Tidmarsh. It's good to know that I'm not the only one here who doesn't know how to use social media. There was also a case of a drug being rejected, a Fortress Bio drug for Menkes disease based on another CMC issue. They received a CRL. So by my count, we've had Ultragenyx, Biogen, Scholar Rock, and now Fortress all getting relatively recent CRLs in orphan pediatric indications that these are all drugs that probably should have been approved. So the bigger question is, how are we feeling about the FDA? How would you guys rate this leadership team and its ability to execute?
Well, can we just double click? And we've talked about this in the past on Ultragenyx. And Ultragenyx, this is UX111 gene therapy for MPS III Sanfilippo syndrome. And remember, this was going to be the first test case under CBERS, which was really Peter Marks's accelerated approval pathway. They got a CRL because of a few sort of idiosyncratic manufacturing related number of temperature probes they need to do on shipping. The FDA actually came out and said, so this is what we mean by interesting, the way they ended up handling it. They said on the clinical side, the data looks really good and it's acceptable, not for accelerated approval, but for full approval based on the data, which was single arm, not controlled against historical control, and based on the benefit from baseline. So they skirted the whole question of an accelerated approval, but they showed flexibility and potentially proving them down the line in efficacy, but they got to work out through the manufacturing issue. So kind of very equivocal sort of how to read that.
Yeah, I guess my point, Yaron, was we got four CRLs, all due to CMC. So again, Biogen, Ultragenyx, as you referenced in detail, Scholar Rock, and now Fortress. And it seems like a lot. I mean, it just seems like we're not getting through the workflow that we need to have happen on a CMC standpoint, which really shouldn't be that hard for some of these indications. Biogen's drug, Spinraza, is already approved, for God's sakes. So I was just referencing maybe some execution missteps there. But again, the bigger
Yeah,
question is how you guys feel about leadership.
good point. Good point on that. Yeah, especially on Spinraza. Good point.
No one wants to pick up that potato. Go ahead, Brian.
Not great. Look, I mean, I think I've been saying this all year, and I think this is sort of like a top-down issue. Is there just seems to be chaos and inconsistency, right? I think the problem is there seems to be a huge gap between, you know, in sort of like idiosyncratic decisions on safety and efficacy on applications, where sometimes there's this enormous level of flexibility and other times there just seems to be no flexibility at all, and it just doesn't seem consistent. And look, I mean, I think it's complicated probably by the different views in HHS, right? And I know we've talked about Vinay before, but right, like Vinay seems like such an odd duck to have in this administration, where he classically is I think perceived by most people as an overregulator, someone who would be all in on having a very powerful FDA to really demand high level safety and efficacy studies. But at the same time, Marty Makary goes out there and just talks about like looking at just preclinical data and maybe approving things just based on AI. So right there is this disparity, and it's very hard, I think, from an industry perspective to kind of hone in and say, oh, this is sort of the level of evidence that one needs for an approval. And I think because of that inconsistency, it becomes quite hard, right? And I think more and more, and this is not just a criticism of the administration, but the prior administration, the administration before that, there's more and more of a demand to try to characterize who is the person who has ultimate power to sign an action letter, and will what's their opinion relative to the review division, and what's their boss's opinion relative to their opinion, because these things have mattered more and more, where one person will feel fine with just overturning everyone else below them's decision on something. And I think that's been a concerning trend that's been going on for a decade or more.
I think you're right. This administration, this leadership team at the FDA did not start that sort of top-down inclination to overrule senior staff members, and that trend has been ongoing for a while. But it does seem like it's potentially accelerated in the last few months, if not years. And we're seeing more and more two-tiering of systems at the FDA, where the top brass have an idea of where they want to go and what they want to do. Maybe it's more politically motivated. Maybe it's higher level policy stuff. But they haven't spent the time to bring along the senior staffers underneath them to their view. So the senior staffers are continuing to conduct reviews. They're continuing to be very, I'd say, rigorous and conscientious in their workflow, but often it doesn't really matter. And that seems to be somewhat problematic. Yaron, you referenced just how hard it is to read this agency. I sense that may be part of the problem. Okay, well, let's move on to some of the big company news of the week. We had yet another meaningful merger and acquisition this week, M&A. I think it's now 5 straight weeks of meaningful deal flow in biotechnology. In this case, it was one larger biotech, Genmab, buying a mid-sized biotech in Merus. The acquisition was valued at about $8 billion, about a 41% premium to where Merus had been trading. And the asset here, of course, is Merus's petosemtamab. It's a bispecific candidate that hits EGFR and LGR5, directed at patients with head and neck cancer. The product petosemtamab is in 2 phase 3 studies, one for first line and one for second line head and neck cancer. And Genmab has talked about also doing additional trials in earlier stages of the disease. The other derivative impact here is that a company that we're involved with, Bicara, was up even more than Merus week to date. Bicara is up almost 50%. I think Merus is up about 37%. What's interesting about that is that Bicara is Merus's chief competitor. So, you might want to ask how can the competitor that didn't get acquired perform or outperform the company that did get acquired? I think there's a lot of sense from investors that there's heated strategic interest in head and neck cancer, a tumor type that really hasn't seen much innovation before. I think now there's some discussion also that there might be other interested parties and strategic transactions that Bicara can benefit from. And even before the Merus news, Bicara was getting the short end of the stick from investors. It had about 1/8 the valuation of Merus. So maybe not surprising to see that disparity in valuation close at least a little bit. But I don't know, Sam or Yaron, did you guys want to add into this discussion?
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, it's one of the I think questions that I immediately ask myself is why didn't any of the larger pharma companies do this? And of course, it doesn't matter from the from the sell side. The dollars that Genmab's paying, I'm sure, is just as valuable as the dollars that a large pharma company would have paid. The interesting thing, of course, here is that I'm sure you've got your view of Bicara and Bicara's data. We do view the Merus data as more broadly applicable in the patient populations, having a look at the HPV-1 negative and HPV-1 positive patients, etc. But the question therefore ends up being, what happens if somebody with deeper pockets or broader shoulders does come out and take up Bicara? What does that mean for Genmab in terms of marketing this product in the longer term? So those are questions that I'd be interested to see what you guys think. The data we could debate the data, right? At the end of the day, they're not directly comparable, different follow-up periods, etc. So it's harder to make it a hard judgment on this. And of course, Genmab could have gone and taken out Bicara, but I think the calculation they made is that they need something that's going to be on the market by 2027. And I'm not sure that is the case for Bicara. So that's the read I've got. And of course, the sense that we got from our valuation analysis, and that's what the company also said, is that the colorectal opportunity here is kind of not really in the calculations. And that's an upside, as is probably some of the earlier uses of the drug. So I'd love to hear what Yaron and you guys think on that. On that comparative efficacy and the risk to Genmab now that it's going to be a competitor to whoever takes Bicara out, or if somebody takes Bicara out.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
yeah, go ahead, Eric.
No, all you, Yaron.
Well, we cover Genmab. So Genmab, we give them a lot of credit. They're a smart team. The challenge in biotech is it's like like The Incredibles, right? Remember when I forget the son runs and he's like first, and then the dad yells at him to be second. In biotech, when you're so successful, in this case it's Darzalex, eventually that party will end, and it's very hard to offset that royalty stream. And so they're really trying and they're getting aggressive. The deal is definitely not cheap, and our colleague Tara was extremely bullish here on Merus, and she had a great call. On the Genmab side, they're taking on a tremendous amount of debt. Just in between the interest expense they're accruing and the loss of interest income from cash is about 430 million we calculate annually. So it's fairly dilutive because you're taking OpEx on top of it. So it's going to be meaningfully dilutive for 2 years. And then the data looks really, really strong. And as you said, Eric, there's the question of why is Bicara undervalued, and because the data doesn't look necessarily that different. It sounds like we're both bullish in this area. On the Genmab side, it's a huge bet because at this point they are fully levered and there's no room to do anything else. And it just kind of tells you that for good assets, you still have to absolutely pay top dollar. This plus the other things that they've done really starts moving them away from that Darzalex cliff, especially if Epkinly works. But they took a lot of risk, which we'll see if it pans out.
Very quickly, I'll just add and say, I think I give them credit for being aggressive, but I do think it's riskier than is being talked about because nobody knows definitively what the response rate of Pembro is in this setting. Um, we've never seen real randomized data, and until we see a randomized phase 3 study with this asset or other assets, this is a classic example of where IO has really surprised people once you actually do randomized trials. So I think that's a risk. And then commercially, maybe why did a big pharma company not step in here? This is a classic case where in today's day and age, there's literally 100 Chinese companies that will sell you one of these for pennies if you are a little more patient and have the, the scale and all of that to not worry about not being first to market and all of that and eventually making it further on down the line. So I think it's risky for those two reasons as well.
Good points, Brad. What about the broader theme here, guys? We have seen substantial M&A each week this fall for now 4 or 5 weeks running. Is there something underfoot here, a real trend, or is this just kind of dumb luck and random clustering of news releases? Brian, you have a thought on that?
I mean, I have a tendency to think it's a little random, but I think people will really push back on me on that and say, it's pharma sort of waking up to the valuation starting to move and trying to take the opportunity to get in before they move too much. But I've always found it kind of hard to find more than just a little bit of an idiosyncratic nature to when M&As occur outside of when it's like a particularly big area that pharma has acute demand for. Like I remember Hep C, there were just a lot of M&As going on there. Maybe in the GLP-1 space you see a little bit of it now, but outside of that, I guess call me one of the more skeptical people that this is like a open door of M&A that's starting to occur.
Eric, just let's not forget though. I mean, I'm not going to disagree with Brian because I'm not sure there's a crystal ball that anyone has. I mean, every year that we started, I think Tim or any banker would tell you, I have a great book of M&A coming up. And of course, this is like the third year that the first half was slow, and then the first quarter, and then it really picked up. So, but you do have people looking into the horizon at lower rates, right? So the opportunity for refinancing down the road can be meaningful at a lower rate. And of course, nobody knows what that rate would be. And at the same time, as a GenMab, you can't just keep waiting until rates actually hit like 2% or whatever it is they're heading to, because they have this cliff and they had to do something, right? Was this the right asset or not? Brad's point is good, although I'm going to try and get that answer for you, Brad. Are people paying just pennies for assets out of China? I doubt it. I've got the numbers. One day I'll add them up and send them to you. I don't know, right? The point is, that is a risk. But at the end of the day, this is the cost of capital should be getting lower. You can't wait for the day that it happens, but at least you can plan forward like that. So there's one element there that could be driving some of this. And of course, more certainty is coming back into this pricing environment, the tariff situation, which I think as time passed, people got more and more comfortable with. And of course, the Albert Bourla and the administration conversation kind of put a cap on that. So perhaps there's some of that, although GenMab, I'm sure, had made up its mind way before that, the announcement from Pfizer and the administration.
Well, it's also, this is nothing new, right? Deals get done when on de-risking events, when the buyer is comfortable and the seller has gotten remunerated. And I think it's also, we can't ignore the fact that the market is finally remunerating companies, so they're much more comfortable selling now. That seems to be kind of our thinking here.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. I do think there is some stochastic nature to deal flow, and nobody really can time their release or their transaction to anything else. On the other hand, Sam, you're right. The macro has changed dramatically, and with MFN and tariffs and some of the other issues behind us, we finally are coming out of a nuclear winter, not just for biotech stocks, but also for pharma transactions. So I would hope that we would see some more of these. Let's continue to move on to some of the clinical data sets from the week. And I guess the big disappointment this week was the MoonLake Therapeutics news. Not sure if others cover this company. I don't, but we do pay some attention to the hidradenitis suppurativa space, the HS space, and MoonLake and their drug were thought to have potentially a best-in-class opportunity here with an IL-17 alpha. Unfortunately, sonelokimab not just failed to differentiate itself versus the incumbent UCB's Bimzelx, but also failed to achieve statistical significance on one of two phase 3 studies. So that really puts the drug's approval in jeopardy in a way that I don't think anyone would have predicted. I think there were a lot of folks trying to game how differentiated sonelokimab might have been versus Bimzelx into this data set, but no one expected, this disastrous result. The stock's down over 85% this week, and I think looking forward, it's really unclear how this company gets out of gets moving forward. So this was a pretty major binary for the industry. I think a lot of us woke up on Monday morning not sure how the XBI was going to perform around it because there was so much cap and interest on this event, and yet we shrugged it off and moved on, and again maybe saw a bigger picture that was more favorable in terms of other companies doing other things at valuations that are reasonable. But Brian, why don't you introduce the Larimar news? I know that was also an interesting situation.
Yeah, another interesting situation, regarded as negative on the day of, but has been climbing back pretty strong. So management's been doing a good job with investors, getting them over the line here. So Larimer's developing a drug for Friedreich's ataxia, and their update was on their clinical study, which is potentially a study that is approvable under Subpart H. I think that's the thesis here. And this drug, it's a recombinant frataxin, which is the protein that's deficient in FA. So the endpoint of this study is actually frataxin levels in skin, and they've already shown good levels in earlier data cuts. And this week they showed in 10 out of 10 patients who had 6 months of frataxin treatment, more than 50% of normal frataxin levels in skin measurements. They also showed a median improvement from baseline in mFARS of 2.25 points. And this is a primary clinical endpoint in FA studies. It was the basis of approval of Biogen's Skyclarys following their randomized controlled study. But this is an open label study, so not an RCT, but showing similar effect size to Skyclarys from baseline. So this is all good. But they also announced that out of 39 patients dosed in the study, 7 of them, or 18%, experienced anaphylaxis. The stock closed on Friday at 5 and change and was in the low threes when it opened earlier this week. But as I said, management's been doing a good job getting investors comfortable. It's climbed back to in the mid fours right now. I think the debate here is skin frataxin a surrogate endpoint that's reasonably likely to provide a clinical benefit, and how much evidence is Larimar generating to make that cause. So I think most people would agree that if you could get functional frataxin levels in the tissues of interest, this would be a no-brainer for Subpart H approval. But skin frataxin, right, it's not a direct measurement of a tissue of interest. It's a surrogate tissue of a tissue of interest. And we don't have measurements of the tissues that would be ideally measured for this study. But it's a very good marker in terms of the amount that they're showing in skin. But the question becomes, when you sort of introduce this very real risk now of anaphylaxis, how confident can one be that the skin frataxin measurements and an improvement in baseline mFARS scores in an open label study, is that enough to kind of support the argument that this is reasonably likely to predict? So fully expect this is going to be another big FDA approvability debate as we get closer and closer to sort of their final cut of data, and they're talking about submitting a BLA for Subpart H in the second quarter of next year. So one to watch closely. It's another name that's sort of on the margins of like, will they, won't they, FDA approval. The FARA Association, the advocacy group here, is very powerful. A lot of people think they had a very significant role in ensuring that the FDA approved Skyclarys itself, which was a subject of a lot of controversy on the street back in the day before Biogen bought it. So look forward to following that one over the next year or so with the FDA debate.
Great recap, Brian. Did you or Sam want to cover Enanta as well and their RSV?
Sure, I'd love to cover Ananta. I've been following that one for large part of my career since they were, one of the main players in Hep C. So they press release data from their respiratory syncytial virus study in high risk patients on Monday, and this is an antiviral for RSV. Or we've had a couple of recent vaccine approvals for RSV, but this is for the treatment of RSV. And pre-market, it was down as it missed the primary endpoint, which was the reduction in lower respiratory tract symptoms. And generally we look at the phase 2 studies on when they miss primary endpoints. People kind of throw them out, and certainly started to look that way. Is down 20% pre-market, and then it started rebounding and has been way up since about midday on Monday. While we were kind of reviewing the data pre-market, I was telling my associates, I was like, oh, I kind of actually think this data is pretty good. Am I crazy? And my associates were smarter than me. They're like, no, you're right. This is like pretty good data. And when I think when you look at it, the question is like, what is an antiviral supposed to do for this disease? And it seems like it's doing all the things that you would want into antiviral. I mean, you're showing very, very clear reduction in viral load, good separation from placebo across the study. They're showing improvement in a number of metrics across the overall study beyond just sort of the 4-symptom lower respiratory tract symptoms. And most importantly, perhaps the pre-specified subgroup that they were looking at of more high-risk patients that are sort of, elderly 75 plus patients or with comorbid COPD, they showed much more robust results. So, I think RSV and look, I mean, Enanta sort of had a tough run in that. I think they're really good at making drugs. They've just sort of gone after indications that have been really hard to define a true clinical benefit or move the needle in since their days in Hep C. And I think respiratory viruses would all agree. It's a hard indication to sort of chase because so many of these diseases resolve in most people so quickly. It's hard to even ever pick up a benefit unless you're running huge studies. So here, I think what they were successful is they found a high risk population that you would truly be worried about with an infection. Not statistically significant, but there was a pretty significant number of patients on control who wound up hospitalized for RSV versus on treatment. And that may just be random noise, but I think with all of the other data points, it's pretty supportive that they have a real antiviral here for this infection. So now the question is the data good enough to find a big pharma partner who'd be interested in developing this as sort of a product to put in the hospitals or older person homes to try to intervene in patients who are higher risk that come down with an RSV infection. And I kind of think it is.
Thanks, Brian. Awesome recap. It really wasn't that busy a week in terms of news flow, and I think we covered all the major data releases. That'll give us an opportunity to maybe do something we don't often get to do on Biotech Hangout, which is look forward a little bit and see what's coming down the road later this month. We've, of course, got major medical conference season kicking off for the fall. And I know a bunch of us are going to be going over to Berlin to see what's happening at ESMO. So we'll talk about that. And right around the corner, for better for worse, is earnings season as well. So I thought maybe we could all chime in on what types of prints we're looking for and maybe who's most at risk for seeing performance around their Q3 earnings results. But let's start with the Q4 conference season. Sam, I know you're going to Berlin. Yaron, are you going as well?
I'm not going to miss going to Berlin.
All right. Yeah. Maybe we should do a version of Biotech Hangout from Berlin on the ground in a few weeks' time.
Just the three of us.
Yeah. I love it. I love it.
But what are you guys looking for? What are you most excited about seeing?
Yaron, go.
Well, for us, it's three things to boil it down to. And I think they're actually all late breakers, interestingly enough. So Amgen's going to have, remember they bought a company called 5' to get your FGFR2 B antibody for gastric cancer based on that promising phase 2. So we're going to see the first phase 3. It's called the Fortitude 101. It's the phase 3 results. These are patients that are overexpressing that fibrogen, growth factor receptor in gastric or gastroesophageal. This is the combination. This is the doublet. And remember, Amgen said they hit the interim analysis on survival. They continue to follow patients, and it looks like the latest cut on survival doesn't look as good as the first cut. And then there is a second study, which is the triplet. So it's chemo, BEMA with IO. They both of them face out probably next year. So that would be the first one. This one, that's for gastric because it's the FGFR. The next is the XL. So they developed the file to Cub. The Cub was it. It's called Zenblitinib. Incumbent with Tecentriq against regorafenib in colon cancer. This one is controversial and important because they did hit survival in all patients in refractory colon. So that's really good. But we don't know what drove the benefit. Was it across all patients? They also had a specific subsets of patients with liver mets who don't do as well. And of course, the one thing to keep in mind is, and this is important for FDA these days, most patients in the study were enrolled outside the US. And there's also a question whether, okay, great, so you beat regorafenib, which is no longer the standard of care. It was approved 12 years ago. It's sort of like the weakest kid on the block. But how do you do relative, across studies to the standard of care, which is two other drugs that do a lot better? So that's going to be really important then to figure out with the new FDA, just having a survival benefit against an old standard is not even relevant when it's conducted ex-US. And then finally, and Eric, this is your turf. We follow BioNTech. You obviously follow Summit, but they have the data with ivonescimab. That's their PD-1 VEGF bispecific with chemo, head-to-head against Tevimbra with B1, Beijing plus chemo. So remember, this is Harmony 6. They beat it in China. This is squamous non-cell small cell. They beat it on PFS, and now we'll see the data. And again, the question is, okay, great. So are you actually going to show survival benefit or not? But I'm not sure the data is mature enough, and hopefully we'll be able to at least look at trends. So all three late breakers, all important.
Go ahead, Sam.
Yeah.
What's on your radar?
So I'll pick up from where Yaron left. Both of those two other studies are quite interesting for us too. But here on Harmony 6, I think what's going to be interesting is the comparator arm is, of course, the tislelizumab with paclitaxel or nab-paclitaxel and carboplatin. There we have data in China. When you look at it comparative to the Keynote 407 data, that of course is Keytruda, it did look better there. So median PFS seemed a little at the same follow-up period, right? Early 7.5 or so months. So the interesting thing would be how the control arm performs in this trial, one that we need to look at, that was the rationale 307 trial, but and PFS, as Yaron rightly said, is quite interesting. And this is, remember, this is squamous cell carcinoma, so a non-small cell carcinoma, and this is a group of patients that normally you would avoid a VEGF inhibitor. And in all the studies that we've seen in the subcuts from even the 3SBio Pfizer drug and the variety of other ones that I've tried to dig up, we don't see the usual problem of hemoptysis, which is bleeding in those patients, which would be the result of VEGF. Remember that at the WCLC, the discussant of the Harmony data said that all he sees here is VEGF activity. So that's kind of continues to argue against that comment. If you think back to that this is just VEGF, which of course I think most people thought that wasn't fair. So that's going to be interesting to look at. Of course, OS, as Yaron said. The one other thing that we're looking at is this: there is a trial from Remgen, which is in gastric cancer, and guess what the target is? PD-1 VEGF. It's in an interesting combination. It's in gastric cancer, a combination of their so it's going to be, of course, safety will be the biggest question here. Claudin 18.2 ADC plus the PD-1 VEGF, so RC148, and or a PD-1 inhibitor. And this, in this case, is Junxi's PD-1 LOQTORZI. So look, it's a trial that's not necessarily enormous, but we're very interested to see how this looks. Is this another VEGF that's going to show up? And no one really has talked about this particular one. So that's one we're looking at just as something that is off the beaten track. And of course, you still have all the Astra, they're in presidential session 1, symposium 1, and they have the first 2. So that's the 2 Destiny Breast, the Destiny Breast 11 and 05, where we're looking for significant efficacy data from there, and I'm pretty sure that it's going to be very good in terms of the readout, because they've already said they've been statistically and clinically meaningful data sets. So we'll wait and see how this all pans out. So I mean, we could keep going on, but I think this is enough for the conversation today.
No, thanks. You guys covered the Summit ivonescimab, or actually the Akeso ivonescimab HARMONi-6 trial quite well. I think it's going to probably be a little bit early to see overall survival, but like the two of you, I'm very keen to see what the hazard ratio is on PFS. We've got a couple of other SMID-cap names that are going to be at the conference as well. IDEAYA has a drug called darovasertib, which is in ocular melanoma with a neoadjuvant update of around 90 or so patients. I think that's also an oral presentation. So I just highlight that as something that has continued to look very, very interesting in ocular melanoma, a tough tumor type with very few alternative options.
I just want to second that, Eric. That was also on my list, but I thought I'd had enough.
That's going to be a good one. That's going to be a good product, in my opinion. And then we're also looking at Verastem in the G12D space. Their partner, another Chinese player, GenFleet, will be presenting now a pretty good cohort of data in pancreatic cancer. This, of course, is looking to try and get a share of a market that's seemingly dominated by Revolution Medicines. But the efficacy data from their G12D on-off inhibitor has looked really good. They've had some tolerability considerations that they need to work around. And again, I just highlight that in pancreatic cancer, another tumor type that's in dire need of innovation, as being quite interesting. We've just got a few minutes here. What's on your bingo cards for Q3 earnings? Any companies in particular that have a lot to gain or lose as we start to turn the clock forward? Yaron, you cover a lot of the big guys.
Well, so argenx we think is probably going to be okay and in line after a huge Q2, so we think that should be okay. Legend, we just published a note today. So recall that they're making Carvykti with Johnson & Johnson. It's a BCMA for myeloma. They're the market leader right now, and they've been capacity constrained, and they've been growing capacity between their current sites in Jersey and in Belgium. And that's been taking probably a little bit slower than expected. Like, I just kind of think if any one of us does a renovation of an apartment or a house or whatever, how long that takes. Think about building complicated global plants. So that they have been bringing more capacity, but it looks like there's going to be an incremental expansion in Q3, and because of it, it looks like they're probably going to be a smidgen light. Still growing mid-teens quarter-over-quarter, but not the 20% Wall Street was looking for. It looks like the new capacity is really going to be kind of late in Q4. So the 1.9 billion consensus, they can probably still hit that, but they might need kind of to round up the numbers to get to 1.9. Anyway, next year is hopefully when they're finally not going to be capacity constrained. But Legend, we've been fielding a ton of questions on. Ascendis is looking good, and I don't know about the rest yet.
What about BioNTech and Moderna with their vaccines? Have you been tracking them?
Well, you go ahead, because I know you're tracking them. They're looking down 50%, right? They're not looking good at all. Go ahead.
No, they're not looking great. I mean, it's hard to do the week-on-week comparisons because of the different starts. But if you put them on the same, I don't know if I'd say 50%, but they look down. The difference, what I find interesting, Yaron, I don't know if you looked at, is that Moderna doesn't seem to have done much with pricing, but based on our data points, Pfizer seems to have taken a price rise this year, so that might mitigate some of the pressure. But that's what I'm looking at. But then I don't cover as many stocks as you do, so.
Yeah, I mean, it
Excellent.
looks like COVID vaccines are sort of a nice to have these days, only for certain populations, you know?
Brian, you get the last word on Q3 earnings.
Yeah, I mean, I would just kind of note, I think there's some interesting launches underway that people will be very focused on. Gilead, obviously, this will be sort of the first real quarter of launch of the lenacapavir PrEP, which has been, really the driving force behind the re-rating over the last year and a half. Vertex will get another quarter of Journavac sales. It is their pain drug that really launched at the very beginning of this year. Neurocrine obviously gets driven a lot by Ingrezza sales, but they have their own launch this year, Chronicity, that started at the beginning of the year. So, I think a lot of eyes will be on that one.
Terrific, guys. Thank you very much. We are out of time, so that brings to a close this episode of the Biotech Hangout. I hope that our listeners will join us next week for another, hopefully very educational setting.